about 9:30, so we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. There's a lot of you standing in the back. There's a front row of seats here. They have reserved signs on it. Just to clear, they're reserved for anyone who's been standing in the back. So please come up and grab a seat so that you have a better vantage point. If I could ask the first question. In my day job, and you touched on this, in my day job at McCarty Associates, we advise companies, mostly U.S. companies, on their global strategies. And until 4 or 5 years ago, Africa didn't play in the parts of the world that companies asked us about. They asked us about South Asia, East Asia, Latin America, Mid-East, not Sub-Saharan Africa. That really has changed. My colleague Levette Torbati, who's a former South African diplomat, is here. My colleague Jim Dunlap of the Scowcroft Group, who runs their African practices here. We now find ourselves focusing commercially on Africa across a broad range, not just the energy companies, not just the mining companies, but companies like Walmart and Google and MetLife who are looking at Africa as opportunities. Now, you mentioned that the business community hasn't really quite done what they might do to sustain and support the broad approach that AFRICOM is helping to support. What could the business community do in Africa that could join forces with the other policies that you put forward? What could we do?
Well, I think the way that can work is through the security partnerships, through some development. We can build a secure enough environment for folks to do business. And then they just have to take the leap of faith to go in and do business in a place where they haven't been before. But the thing to think about is this is a massive emerging middle class. I read the numbers, I forget exactly what they are. I think it's something like a third of the population in Africa now is part of the middle class. That's the total population of over 400 million people. They are an emerging market, and that's why China's there. That's why India's there. They see them as an emerging market with opportunities. And I think you need to just start doing business and pick those places where you can begin to build those relationships. I will say the biggest challenge there is infrastructure. That is the challenge, and in some way that's what holds back a lot of people from investing there. Well, when I was in Uganda, they were talking about Uganda is the second largest producer of bananas in the world and eminently exportable crop. They don't export too many of them because they have a hard time getting them where they need to go. Roads, bridges, ports. It's a metaphor here, by the way, from the United States investing in infrastructure at this time. But that's a different topic. I won't get into that. But that's the biggest thing they need, build an infrastructure. And what China and the other countries have done, they've invested in the infrastructure. They've set up the businesses, if they're going to do business there, this is what you need. We'll build the road, we'll build the bridge. We'll help you develop the port. And I think we need to be willing to make that investment as well to build a relationship and build out a partnership. But the simple answer is get in, invest, get started. Because I think there is an opportunity, particularly if you take it in a way that builds that relationship. Because even though China is present and China is growing in the export market for Africa, there's some resentment as well. As China tends to come in, they only want to hire Chinese nationals, they bring them in, and it has sort of an exploitation feel to it, which Africa has felt far, far too many times in the past. I think if we come in with the broader whole of government U.S. business approach that says we're looking after your interests as well as ours, I think there's an opportunity to come up with a different model that will work better than what China's doing right now. I think we should take that chance.
You put your finger on something that our clients talk to us about all the time, which is corruption, rule of law, and institutions. The first question is, can we do business in Africa in a way that isn't going to send us all to jail? And I think that really is the key, helping build that legal infrastructure. Plenty of time for questions. I think, do we have a microphone that will go around? No? No microphones?
So you'll have to speak up loud and identify themselves.
Yeah, exactly right. We'll start with this gentleman right here in the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Nee Akwete. I'm from Ghana, but I've worked on U.S. foreign policy here in Washington for decades. Thank you very much for your remarks. I have friends who would think that I gave you some talking points, only on some, because we agree so much, including put the interests of the African partners, worry about those as well. 2 years ago, I was worried about Africans' role in Mali, and I wrote a piece because I didn't think it would go well. if you don't mind, I'd like to give you a copy. And now, of course, I'm worried about what has gone on there. The country has fallen apart. And last month, I testified in the Africa subcommittee. So my question is, I have a two-part question. Would you please use your influence to have the Armed Services Committee hold a hearing to look into what has happened in Mali? Because we really don't know all the facts. The Washington Post story has made that clear. So would you please consider a hearing? And the other part is, would you also consider bringing AFRICOM's permanent headquarters to the U.S. For the sake of jobs and conditions of service for the personnel? And Mr. Cunningham, I have two African ladies here with me. There are about 4 million African-born people here and their families. I think they are a great resource that the U.S. can use in outcompeting China. So please consider that. Thank you.
I think both of those are worthy concerns, and I think, Mali is certainly very disappointing because there was great promise there. Millennium Challenge Corporation, went in there. They're one of the key countries that we set up a relationship with, and the MCC is all about, again, bottom up, develop a plan. But I will say that I think Mali is also a decent model of what I was saying earlier, that absent security, development doesn't happen. They lost control of the northern part of the country, which is an enormous patch of land, and they lost control of security. And ironically, I think the military members who led the coup led it in part because they were frustrated because the government wasn't doing enough to deal with that problem. And then in leading that coup, of course, they further empowered the very forces that they were concerned about. So I think a breakdown in security was a big part of the problem there, and that's something we're going to have to work to solve. And the idea of moving AFRICOM back to the U.S., I'll certainly take it under advisement. And that was one of the controversies, and where do we put it? We're going to put it in Africa or wound up in Germany. But I think certainly that's a reasonable suggestion. I have not heard the argument because there are so many people of African descent in the U.S. that there could be a stronger connection there, certainly, than having it in Europe. So, no, sure. Yeah. Any number of hands there. Yes, we'll work our way back here. Go ahead.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Rosemary Segel. I'm the president of a company and an organization. I'm from Kenya, based here in Washington, D.C. Thank you so much, American Security Project and Congressman. I had spoken to General Petraeus and the former AFRICOM Commander Watts about partnership. And thank you so much for speaking about partnership, because I was telling them AFRICOM and the American security needs to work with civil society. Civil society on the table, women, especially who are transparent more than men, on the table to sit and talk about security in Africa. You talked about Kenyan violence in the election. My nephew was one of those who were killed in the Kenya 2007. So we are coming up with this election, and we really want your support on capacity building and training of Kenyans, so that we don't have the same problem. Looking at it, I was just going to comment on AFRICOM in Germany. He talked of AFRICOM being in America. AFRICOM should go to Africa, because that's where it's supposed to be whenever there is emergency or enemies, and that's where it needs to be. So involve us, our organizations, African organizations based here, to collaborate and be partners of the African Security Project and the AFRICOM. Thank you.
Thank you. And one of the most encouraging things that happened to us in Kenya is we have a group of young people who are doing democracy training right now. They have a huge group of folks that are all dedicated to getting people to vote, but not just getting them to vote, getting them to understand the democratic process. And part of that is understanding that within the democratic process, you lose on occasion, and that's okay. It's about the larger process, not about any one individual. We had lunch with this group of young people that were out there doing that. It's incredibly inspiring. So I think they're hope for a better result this time. Yes, go ahead. You first. The gentleman in front first, then you. And then I'll move to the right. Yes.
Warren Burrell, USA Today. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about Mali. What's the plan there? How's that going to be handled? What should happen there? Is it going to happen? And how much of a threat to the United States
Take the last part of the question first. I think at this point it's a pretty low-grade threat to the U.S., and that's one of the things that we're trying to figure out when we monitor the spread of Al-Qaeda and their ideology is how those threats pop up. A lot of it is locally driven. Al-Shabaab for a long time was locally driven, and Algeria was locally driven, and that's a problem certainly, but our chief concern, national security-wise, is, do we have transnational terrorists? Are they attempting to strike at Western targets more broadly, in the U.S. or in Europe or elsewhere, or are they fighting a more local battle? And it's always difficult to tell. Al-Shabaab was considered to be a locally driven group for a long time, and they sort of expanded out, affiliated with Al-Qaeda. One of my hopes, by the way, is that the Al-Shabaab experience will make it clear that affiliating with Al-Qaeda is not a wise move, that it puts you in a position of vulnerability you would just as soon not be in. But that's still developing in terms of what the movement, Boko Haram in Nigeria, the folks in Mali, the folks who are still in Algeria, they seem to be a more locally driven group, but that's, as we've learned in Yemen as well, that's true until it's not. So we've got to keep a very careful eye on it and see how it spreads. But more largely, they destabilize a region, and we'd rather not have that destabilization. And I think the secret, again, is security and building partnerships. And one of the things that hamstrings us in this is, as I mentioned earlier, we want to build partnerships with legitimate governments, not with illegitimate governments. You don't build partnerships with someone who just sponsored a coup and overthrew a democratically elected government. We had this problem in Mauritania as well. So we're going to look for partners in the region. There are countries in that area, certainly Ghana, Burkina Faso, other countries that we could work with to build partnerships to try to build security. But for right now, it's not going to be a controllable situation. We're not in a position to simply go into Mali and fix it. We're going to have to slowly rebuild a legitimate government in Mali so that we can then begin to partner with them on security. That's the key. Yes?
Lauren Block with the Congressional Research Service. You've given a really good overview, I think, of the issues at play with U.S.-Africa relations today. I'm curious, in your talk about partnership, your committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee over the last 6 years have given DoD new authorities to fund these types of partnership programs.
Right.
And those are activities that have been traditionally funded by the State Department, the that account, keeping account. And those monies are shrinking in this current budget environment. Do you see those 12 series authorities as becoming a permanent piece of the DoD funding puzzle, or is this something you see eventually going back to the state?
Well, I hope that at least a portion of it will be department. And some of those, like 1206, is State Department driven, with the Department of Defense as a partner. So I think that those are critical pieces. And this is a matter of great controversy. I've done a lot of work with the development community. I've worked on global poverty and development outside of the armed services realm. They haven't historically had a very positive view of the military. It's a different role. They don't think that the military should be doing development, and so there's been that hostility. In the last decade or so, partnerships have begun to be built in a way that I think is breaking that down in a positive direction. I think the Department of Defense needs to be involved in development because security and development go hand in hand. And if you draw that line, okay, your security, your development, you miss out on the ability to build partnerships that are going to be absolutely necessary. Now, is DoD doing too much? Probably. I think some of that should transition back over to the State Department. But I think it is incredibly helpful if we can break out of that little mold that says DoD should have nothing to do with this. They need to have something to do with it because, again, absent security, you don't have development. Look at Afghanistan. They can't do a lot of the development projects that they want to do because they don't have security. So that partnership is going to be necessary. And to the extent that DoD has a little bit of a hand in development, that makes that partnership, I think, easier to build. And yes, all the way. Sorry. Yes, ma'am, all the way in the back.
Okay. It's actually, I'm sorry, Laura Lumpkin from the Open Society Foundation. It's actually a follow-on to Ms. Block's question. So I think she was asking, I'm not sure, but a broader question about the security assistance pieces that are being funded out of each year the NDAAs are giving new military aid authorities, either as a permanent law in Title X or as a several-year trial period. So if as we've tallied, the DoD budget now can provide, there are about 20 different authorities for foreign assistance-like activities. Most of them security aid, some of them development related.
Right.
So if the DoD is going to become a bigger player in providing money for foreign assistance-like activities.
Has become.
Yes, has become, for sure. So then shouldn't you also have to become, should the DoD have to become transparent in terms of what it's providing? The State Department sends to the Hill every year a congressional presentation document for what it plans to do and reports on previous year expenditures. DoD doesn't have to do anything like that. There's no forward-looking accountability. I know the first line of defense are going to say this is all contingency-driven, but it's not all contingency-driven. Nobody plans like the DoD plans.
Okay.
And
I
so,
wasn't going to say that, but.
so is there any reason why the DoD should not be, you spoke very rightly about democracy, an important focus on democracy abroad with this assistance. A key part of that is transparency, being public and accountable about what we're doing, with whom we're doing it, as both for our democracy here and abroad. So is there some reason why we shouldn't be expecting some accountability, some transparency, and oversight, or increased public?
There is some accountability, there is some oversight, there is some transparency. It's wrong to say that there's not. We certainly on the committee, we have oversight over this, we make those decisions. We've had many battles over many of these authorities and whether or not they should be continued. But you are correct to say that the transparency is not as great as in the State Department. And I think that's a very legitimate point. If they're going to move more in that direction, there should be greater transparency. And that's part of it. Historically, the Department of Defense is a little more jumpy about that sort of thing. In the security world, you want to keep a certain close hold on what you're doing and where you're doing it. But I think we could probably strike a better balance on that. I think that's a very legitimate point.
Can I call your staff?
My staff's here. Yes.
Mark Jacobson of the German Marshall Fund and formerly the Deputy NATO Representative in Afghanistan. So I've watched this civilian-military interface very closely the last couple of years. I wanted to echo something that was said earlier on AFRICOM, just to pile this on to keep it in front of your mind. We've seen CENTCOM have a U.S.-based headquarters and a forward-deployed headquarters, and that, I think, resolve some of the political antibodies that are in the system against the permanent headquarters being in Africa. But I do think there's a very good case for a home base and an overseas operational focused headquarters. And to follow up on the second theme, I really applaud the work you've done over the last several years to kind of narrow this gap between, let's say, Title 22 and Title 10, development and military operations. I agree that security must be a prerequisite to development. So I'm wondering, what are the next steps in terms of changes to Title 10, and probably more importantly, although out the armed services, and it's not just a matter of money, it's enabling Office of Transition Initiatives, ATI, just started a crisis response capability, or just want to take that off. But again, I think there's no way, as parochial as I am towards the Special Forces, they cannot do stabilization, that middle ground, and development nearly as effectively as AID can in a consistent way. So how do we fix this?
Single biggest thing is to actually reform our development policy in a way that makes it more functional. And this has been one of my greatest disappointments of the last 3.5 years, is there is a clear model for how to do development policy better than we do it. And we have steadfastly refused to make even one step of progress towards working towards that better model. The model I use is the Department for International Development in Great Britain. What's different about the way they do development policy than the way we do it? First of all, it's coordinated. The person who is in charge of the Department for International Development actually controls about 95% of the development money. In the U.S., it's spread all over hell. Nobody, well, theoretically, the Secretary of State is in charge of development policy, but since the Secretary of State is primarily in charge of diplomacy, it's impossible for that person to be in charge of it. We could not possibly have a better Secretary of State on development policy. Just couldn't. And yet the State Department still is not able to prioritize it the way that I think it should be. And that makes perfect sense. You might have noticed there's a couple of diplomatic issues going on out there in the world. Peace in the Middle East, what we do about China, what we do about North Korea, right? All that. Development policy is always going to be secondary to diplomacy within the State Department, which means it's not going to get the attention that it deserves, and it's not going to get the support that it deserves. And then we also couldn't possibly have a better USAID director. Raj Shah is brilliant, doing a fabulous job, doing the best he possibly can with what's in front of him. But what's in front of him is he doesn't really control development policy, because he's got a good chunk of money that he's got no say over. I mentioned the Millennium Challenge Corporation, PEPFAR, whole series of different issues. In fact, there was just something that happened yesterday that made this even worse. I fear I'm looking at Katie, she's sent an email about this. There's another, but the Global Health Fund. The Global Health Fund will not be under USAID. Brilliant. One more thing within development policy that's going to be scattered off into the wind. So you could consolidate those programs, elevate the importance of USAID, and this, by the way, is part of the problem with the Department of Defense. The Department of Defense looks at the way our development policy is structured and says, yeah, I don't trust these people. They're not structured in a way to be effective, so we're going to do it. You know, reference my earlier comment about how can you do it, the answer is always yes. And I will say, and I'm biased, of course, because I do a lot of work with Special Operations Forces and the military in general, I think they're doing a pretty darn good job. When you look at what they were like plopped down in the middle of Iraq and Afghanistan, and all of a sudden they had to be, you know, development experts and all these other things they've never trained to do, they figured it out pretty quick and did a pretty darn good job. Now, it's not ideal. I'd rather have the development experts doing it, but given the, try not to swear when I'm on television, the messed up nature of the development, I mean, it's hard to disagree with. You know what? We're just going to do it. Okay. So, single most important thing is reform development policy. If the central pillars of our foreign policy are supposed to be defense, diplomacy, and development, that third piece of it just isn't working as well as it should because it's not structured to work well. I'm not even talking about spending more money on it. Just spend what you've got there now better and more effectively. And the final thing I'll say about this, you flipped the switch on me there. This is a very important issue to me. You know, even the money that Raj does control over in USAID is broken down into so many different pots that he has very little flexibility. A problem may pop up on food security and say, well, gosh, we need some money for this. Well, no, that money has to go to, you know, educating girls in Latin America. It's in that pot. Or this money has to go to, you know, tuberculosis in I don't know where. And you can't take it out of that pot because Congress has put it in there. We have taken our development arm and just throttled it and then expected it to succeed. We've got to come up with a better system, and that's the most important thing.
We have taken a more unilateral approach to how we're going to integrate development and security over the last few years. Leap back about 5 years or so, we were part of G8, we were talking about what the agenda was going to be for Africa on security and on development. And I'm trying to figure out whether our success or failures now have in Mali or Congo have to do with a unilateral approach that really can't be effective because we don't have the capacity to do it all there. I can contrast that with Kenya and Somalia, where I believe we've taken a more multilateral approach.
No question.
And so I'm wondering what you think about what the future is for the way we're going in terms of working with our partners on that kind of issue. And if I take that multilateral a little further and take the Congo, I'm trying to figure out why we're not also doing the kinds of things we're doing multilaterally in Kenya and Somalia to deal with the issues. I know we're working on MRA and all of that.
Right.
But why are we working, do I not know something? Are we not working multilaterally in a way that would make sense of the challenge?
Let me answer that last piece first. I mean, the main reason that we're not working, I hope to build towards that. The main reason is because Al-Shabaab, what's going on in Somalia, is perceived as a direct threat to the U.S. So we are more interested in that area than we are interested in the Eastern Congo. That's just the fact. So we worked with Kenya, we worked with Ethiopia, we worked with Djibouti and Uganda to focus on dealing with the problem in Somalia. Now, the second reason, and it applies in Somalia as well, is you need a local partner. I'm not going to say that we had more of a local partner in Somalia than we had in Eastern Congo. Same problem was there. But one of the other impediments to actually getting more actively engaged in the Eastern Congo is that the Eastern Congo is, a little too strong a statement to say ungoverned, but it's close. Kinshasa is a long way away. And there's not a lot of security structure there. Ideally, we would go in and we would work with some Congolese government entity, police force, military, whatever, they're not very effective. In many cases, they're part of the problem. They are preying on the citizenry as well. But again, you can look at Somalia and say, we didn't like Somalia was any better in that regard, and we dove in and found a way to make it work there because it was more of a priority. So I think we can do that. I'm going to address the other point that you made about working in a more multilateral. I don't know if it's gotten any worse in the last few years, but I think we do tend to have a more unilateral approach than we should, and the whole theme of this is building partnerships. But that's why I'll go back to, we got to get our development policy right, because then there's force multipliers beyond that. You know, you've got the local countries, obviously, that you want to work with. There is an unbelievable number of NGOs globally that are interested in a wide variety of these issues. We can work with them and we can better use those resources. And then there are, we work with Great Britain and all that, but we don't have our own development policy as straight as it should, so it's hard to build those partnerships. And that's one of the frustrating aspects of development policy for me is there's so much money, there's so many people doing so many things that they're stepping on each other constantly. There's a lack of coordination. And I think the U.S. needs to take a much stronger leadership role in building that coordination. Yeah, so we can talk about here, go ahead.
Emily Kay, I'm with Congressional Quarterly, and I wanted to see if you could talk a little bit more about the presence of the CIA and drones in Africa, because we're hearing increasing reports of that. I'm curious if you think there's enough oversight of that, and if that risks risking some of the partnerships that you spoke about, because obviously local populations do not seem to be really enthusiastic about those sorts of presences on their soil.
I mean, it depends on what the presence brings about. Intel is part of what we're going to do there. I think the local population in Mali would be really excited if we were providing them intel on what's going on in the north of their country that they can't get access to. So I don't buy, and I know this, I've read the stories have this sort of ominous overtone, isn't this a huge problem? I kind of disagree with that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but Intel has to be part of the partnership that we're talking about here. That can be part of the capacity building that's necessary to help deal with the problem. The hunt for the Lord's Resistance Army and Joseph Kony, got to know where he is. I don't see Uganda, having the type of ISR capability that's going to let them know who's there. Intel's part of it, and that's, Intel by its very nature is not something that you want to put on television, sorry, or in the newspaper. So there has to be a certain secret aspect to it. So it's a challenge. You got to do it right, and it's got to be with the local partners. You don't want to be showing up without their knowledge. You want to work with them in a cooperative way. But that's different than saying we want to blast it all over the newspapers and make it completely transparent, every single Intel operation that we're running anywhere in the world. That I would be opposed to.
Do you have oversight of that? I mean, do you feel like...
Oh, yes, we have oversight over it. I don't want to paralyze them by saying you can't do anything without talking to all 535 of us first. But we have an Intel committee, we have an Armed Services committee, we have many hearings, many discussions. I am in the SCIF, the Intel place, at least 2-3 times a week, having these conversations. That's what a lot of other members do. Yes.
BJ Holcomb from the International Crisis Group. On a more macro level, how do you balance the signals that the U.S. sends to these local partners with the ability of the United States to be critical? So, for example, Uganda is a very important partner in Somalia. Ethiopia is a very important partner. Obviously, arguably also Somalia and certainly Sudan. At the same time, there's a perception of conflict in certain among some people who follow that. Both those countries that have passed in the last time they had elections, and those elections weren't really played in a fair playing field.
There's a long-winded version of this, but the answer is it's hard. Because of the point that I made earlier, you want legitimacy for that government, and that legitimacy is very important. They don't have it if there isn't transparency, if there's too much corruption, and I think we have to continually try to push them in that direction. And part of the argument we can make is, look, you're not going to be successful if your population isn't behind you, but that's not always going to work. And you have to balance that and make it difficult. I do believe that it's not as simple as it's often portrayed, that if some country's doing something wrong, you have to cut them off in order to force them to do something right. I think it's a series of very difficult diplomatic choices in a very complicated chess game that you need able diplomats to play. Now, I think we do have to push these countries for all the reasons I stated up front, that you have to have a better human rights record, you have to have a more transparent, more legitimate government if you're going to be successful. but it's not always easy. It's a very, very difficult part of it. Yes, and I gotta go in the back.
John, I would agree with you, especially partnerships sometimes, it makes sense to, how do you see a role for Europe in Africa? Some of the broad questions. And then in terms of the proposed systems army, it could be seen as throwing a cup of tea on a house fire in terms of the incentives. They try to explain sort of strategy that has been taken by this administration. Do you feel it's effective in your personal opinion? Do you think this is the right stance at the right time?
I do, yeah, and I think that's because there's a bit of a misunderstanding out there about what we're doing with the Lord's Resistance Army and what's happening there. It has been portrayed in the media because it's simple and straightforward to say, we're going to get Joseph Kony. That's what it's all about. And you go, well, Joseph Kony is one guy, there's all sorts of stuff going on, really you can focus all that energy and effort there. That's not what it's about. What it's about is partnership building. We are building the capacity and the partnership that we have, in this case very specifically with Uganda. They're going after the LRA, but that's but one step in the larger issue. And that's really misunderstood. And I think timing is part of it. The plan to begin working with the Ugandans to go after the LRA was being thought about and developed long before the Invisible Children put out the video and made Joseph Kony, this internationally known person. Oh, good, they're going to get him. It's not really what it's about. The partnership that you're talking about, all partnerships start with one project here, one project there. You work on. We're also working with the Ugandans to get them more involved in what's going on in Somalia to build their capacity as well. And when you look at the LRA, they cross over a lot of lines into the Eastern Congo. Potential to build a partnership with the Eastern Congo, as I talked about earlier. Central African Republic, potential there, South Sudan. All of that is part of a larger partnership. If, in fact, the sole reason we were doing all of this was to kill or capture Joseph Kony, then yeah, that would not be a wise policy. But that's not what it's about. It's about the larger partnership building that hopefully can lead, ideally, if you want to talk about the specific huge problem, the Eastern Congo. If we could, use those partnerships to help bring greater stability to there, that would be enormously important. And as far as Europe, that's why I mentioned it, but I think it's an incredibly important part of the partnership. Obviously, they have historical connections to Africa, not always good, but nonetheless, they do have knowledge of the area and are actively involved and engaged. And we've seen that in Libya, so much other places where those relationships and those partnerships can be helpful. I got to give folks in the back here a chance. Yes.
Just under 5 minutes.
Okay, I'll take 3 more. You two, and then all the way in the back. I'll take the 3 in the back. You two, and then the one in the right in the back there. Go ahead. Yes, you can
Thank you
start.
very much, Congressman Smith. My name is Fred Oladende with the Foundation for Democracy in Africa. And thank you for your remarks. Wanted to ask you a question in order to achieve that golden opportunity you've talked about. How do you see trade being used as a tool to reinforce the security efforts gains that have been made? We know that the AGOA clause is coming to an end of September.
A piece of it.
A piece of it.
Yeah.
And we also know that by 2015, we would be seeing an end to it. If you were looking at the prison, how do you see the United States using trade in Africa to encourage and improve democracy? Given the fact that we have players like China that may not have the same interest in terms of human rights and democracy as major stakeholders now.
I think it's critically important, as Nelson queued me up quite well to start something I've worked on. Ultimately, that, trade is much better than a one-off aid project. So if you can build the capacity of a country to grow economically, and trade's going to work. As I mentioned in Uganda, you got all those bananas, a lot of people out there who would buy them. If we can build the trade doing something, then they grow economically, and it creates opportunity. I think trade is absolutely critical to it, and a great opportunity for the U.S., again, both for exports and imports, to build that relationship. So I think extending the, third nation textile provision in AGOA is incredibly important, and I'm all for expanding. I've been a sponsor of a bill for a while that's duty-free, quota-free for the 50 poorest nations in the world. Whatever we can do to enhance those relationships and partnerships will be very beneficial to Africa, but I think beneficial to us as well. Yes, ma'am. Yes, you.
Me?
Yes.
Just following up on that gentleman's question about Ethiopia. You have a very
demonstrating character in Ethiopia is really a brutal dictator running that country. And are you just saying that because you have security interests and you just deny that this brutal dictator happens to, rule Ethiopia? In fact, told us in 2010, the election, he won it by 99.6%. And a 547 member parliament, there's one opposition.
That's a little hard to believe.
So how do you reconcile this, hypocrisy of this policy? If you rail against Mugabe and you leave us alone, people are going to say, what is with American foreign policy, really?
Well, I would say, yeah, and the answer I gave was different. I think you do have to put pressure on them. We've done that in places before. I mean, we had huge security interests in Mauritania. They had a coup. We stopped doing business with them. Same thing just happened in Mali. So, no, I think you do have to put pressure. And each individual situation is going to be different. And it's not easy. Because like I said, you don't want to reach a position where, if someone does something that is not what we want them to do, we're done, we're not having any relationship with them. On the other hand, you don't want to, just turn away because you have interest in it. I agree. I think every single country is going to be very difficult. I wouldn't want to have to be the diplomat making those decisions because you want greater freedom, you want greater democracy, greater opportunity, less corruption, all of those things. But the ability of an outside country to force another country to do that, it's an art, not a science. We can push them, and we should. I wouldn't say at all that you simply turn a blind eye if you have interest. That's what I think got us in trouble in the first place. That's what undermined our ability to have those relationships. But it's simply not that easy. I mean, you have to figure out how to maintain a partnership and build that relationship while pushing them at the same time. It's a very difficult diplomatic line to walk.
But nothing has been done, in the case of Ethiopia. I mean, President Obama talks about eloquently about building, strong institutions, African strong institutions, not strong men. But then, on the other hand, if U.S. policy supports these strong men in Uganda and Ethiopia.
Yeah, I think that is a very, very legitimate point. It's something that we really need to work on. But if the solution is to say, okay, Ethiopia, Uganda, you're off the list, we're not going to have any relationship with you, you could go a long way towards saying that. Now, there's a good deal of distance between what we're doing and what I just proposed, and I would say we need to find some of that distance, put greater pressure on countries like Ethiopia and Uganda, not simply do what they want. I would be supportive of you in saying that we ought to do that, certainly, to try to push them towards greater freedom, greater democracy, without a doubt. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Congressman. My name is Sylvie Bell, and I'm with the Cameroon American Council, and my question is regarding African-born U.S. veterans as well as African-born military. At the Cameroon American Council, we do have an initiative with African-born military, the United States military. One of the considerations we would like for you to consider would be to include as collaboration or partnership with Americans who have African immigrant heritage. You talked about Europe having a history with Africa. Some of the strongest partners would be the men and women who are already serving the U.S. military, who understand the language, the nuances, and understand are already serving the United States, but have expertise and ties with Africa. Is that something that possibility in terms of outreach, in terms of collaborating with African-born U.S. military and veterans? We have one of them here, Faliwa Rudolph, who just returned from Afghanistan.
That is an outstanding idea, and I think that level of cultural awareness is a huge part of being successful, true in the military, true in the State Department. Because again, I think the thing about, it's got to be bottom-up, it's got to be driven by the local population, the better understanding you have, and no two countries in Africa are the same. Areas in the same country, you have to have a cultural understanding of who you're dealing with if you're going to be able to build a successful partnership with South Africa. And that's one asset that we have that we should certainly deploy. Well, thank you. The questions about saying, I wish I could have taken them all, but it's been a great discussion. I hope this will continue. This is a critical area of public policy, and I'm going to keep working on it.
Thank you, Congressman. There are two things that are just eminently clear to me after this morning's question session. First, the pent-up demand for thoughtful leadership on Africa is incredible. Just look at the numbers of people we have this morning, look at the intensity and thoughtfulness of the questions that were put. And the second thing that's clear to me is that we're all really lucky to have Adam Smith thinking about these issues. So thank you, Congressman. Thank you.